After several reschedulings, former Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver will finally be sentenced on federal corruption charges. You will recall that he accepted bribes and kickbacks during his almost 20-year reign as Speaker of the Assembly, one of the most powerful men in the state. And not too long after his sentencing next month, former Senate Majority Leader Dean Skelos will also be sentenced on his own corruption charges. Their trials were almost concurrent as well, and so now they're still linked in fate. Joining me in studio to talk more about this is legal expert Paul DerOhannesian. Actually, he represented former Senator Tom Libous during his corruption trial, which did not go terribly well for him. He is no longer a senator. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, Paul. It's good to see you. So, first of all, we should establish this. As is normal, the prosecution is looking for the book to be thrown at the former Assembly Speaker. The defense is looking for leniency. There have been reams of letters written on his behalf from his wife, from his rabbis, from his friends, from himself, in which he apologized. He could face something quite lengthy, but he probably will not. Why?
Well, it depends what you mean by lengthy. One of the problems he faces is that the guidelines call for a sentence in terms of jail time between 22 and 27 years.
Right.
Probation is recommending 10 years. The prosecution is saying we want at least 15 years or so. But given that the guidelines, which are the starting point in this case, are extremely high, that doesn't bode well for his jail time.
But my understanding of the guidelines also is there's a certain actually a fair degree of discretion left to the judge.
Absolutely.
But there's also a formula, sort of. I mean, the formula is that the judge has to take into consideration, for example, prior history, and the former Assembly Speaker has no massive convictions that we know of. I mean, maybe he had a speeding ticket or something, but nothing like this.
That's right. The criminal history would be one aspect of those factors, but there's many other factors which include character of the defendant. We saw recently that the prosecution wants to introduce evidence of his character, his affairs, which they allege show a misuse of public position.
Right.
The judge indicated the reason she was releasing that filing was because she was going to consider it at sentencing, and therefore it should be a public record. That's the type of additional factor that doesn't help him as a defendant. In addition, your starting point is so high.
So and also there's the mere fact that he defrauded the public. I mean, that speaks to his character as well, I would assume.
It does. That's a big point. And that's a factor you can say with any elected or public official. What the prosecution is doing in this case is highlighting the fact that he was the leader of the legislative body and that his corruption over such a large period of time framed the institution, set an example for others. And I think that's where he faces another issue, which is being a leader, being in a supervisory role, enhances the seriousness of his conduct as opposed to just a backbencher.
So the issue regarding the infidelities, I mean, can the judge take into consideration, I mean, is it fair, and actually is it even possible to divorce yourself from your own personal opinions regarding extramarital affairs? I mean, it's not the cheating on the face of it that's the problem, at least not from the U.S. Attorney's perspective. It's the misuse of public authority vis-a-vis the girlfriends, getting them jobs or giving them treatment. In one case, we're speaking of a lobbyist, or at least that's one of the individuals who was exposed in the press, who had an affair with the former speaker, got favorable treatment for her clients.
That's the allegation that the prosecution is making as to why this is relevant conduct. And in the other situation, helping someone get a state job and using his position to do so. That is important if that is actually what happened, and the judge is going to decide whether or not there's a basis to believe that.
But if it was forgive the phrase, a garden variety affair with a person who was not involved in state government in any way, shape, or form, that there was no misuse of public authority, would that be considered by the judge? Could that be considered as it regards to the character of the individual?
Much less likely that it would play any role in the case. But if you look at many affairs, they tend to involve other benefits or quid pro quos in the relationship. And if you looked in many private sector cases, you could argue that someone got a promotion or position because of that affair, and that could be used to enhance perhaps punishment, and even in a fraud case. A lot of lawyers on the blogs of lawyers are concerned about this case, saying, look, a generation ago, we never saw this type of factor being used against the defendant. You look at this filing, and it's scary if this is where we're headed.
Well, right. I wanted to talk to you also about the precedent setting here. I mean, Dean Skelos has come after Sheldon Silver in this situation. I mean, Sheldon Silver was accused first and subsequently convicted first, and now he's going to be sentenced first. I mean, that's sort of the order of things since it started earlier. But will there be a bearing, do you think? I mean, judges are human. Whoever sentences Dean Skelos can't look at this and not consider it, or at least be influenced by it in some way, whatever the outcome is.
Theoretically, each case is supposed to be considered independently. Some people believe, as you suggested, that they are influenced by that. In fact, the filing by the government does ask the judge to consider what's happened to others, and saying, look what happened in terms of the Boylan case. He got 14 years.
Right.
That's why this case should be at least 15 years. In fact, the government filing says, look at what's happened to everybody else. Here's the framework within which you should sentence this individual. Now, whether that's right, appropriate, is for the judge to decide if they want to look at that, because it is a factor how similarly situated people get treated. You're supposed to avoid disparities. The question is, does this mean if he gets 15 years, is that a good number or bad number? It's still a bad number, but if he got 20 years, I think that would even be worse for others in terms of setting a benchmark.
You know, also, how much will it come into play what people have written, what he has written on his own behalf? He said he was sorry, he said he was very contrite, perhaps not contrite enough in some people's opinions, and then subsequently his wife Rosa, who of course is doubly wronged if in fact the extramarital affair allegations are true, says, well, and by the way, he's ill. He has prostate cancer, and he's suffering from a sort of cancer that killed a family member, and that terrifies me. How much will the judge be able to take that into consideration?
The judge can take all those factors into consideration. That goes back to your initial question about the different factors that come into play in sentencing. That includes his background, that includes his character, his good deeds. The response to that is, oh, well, every elected official is supposed to engage in good deeds. However, there probably is a difference in terms of the good deeds of elected officials. And there are good deeds that go beyond what's expected of a public official, and it's up to a judge. There's no magical formula to determine what weight he or she wants to give those factors.
So we're almost out of time. I just want to ask predictions.
My predictions is it will be in the 15-year range. You're going to see a high fine, probably around $1 million, and probably millions of dollars in restitution. So it will be probably the most serious or significant sentence we've seen in any public corruption case in New York State.
And just to be clear, Sheldon Silver's not a young man.
No, and for him, any lengthy sentence will be virtually a life sentence, particularly if he is ill, as he says.
Well, Paul, thank you very much for your time. We'll have you back, and once we get word of this, and we will dissect it yet again. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure.